Hey folks, welcome back to the Ruperia world, and I am Abhinay Gupta. So today again we will be continuing with the standards on auditing, right? And the specific standard under consideration for today's lecture would be SA 620, which is using the work of an auditor's expert. Please mark the word over here, auditor's expert, right? We are not referring to the management's expert at any place in this standard. Right? Do you remember where we dealt with the management's expert concept, where the auditor had to evaluate the work of the management's expert? Any one of you? I'm giving you 3 seconds time. 1, 2, 3. Okay. We dealt with the management's expert in SA 500, the audit evidences. Right? One of the evidence was again the data that has been given to you by the expert of the management. Right? Then over here, if you remember, you had to judge the competency, capabilities and objectivities of the expert, right? And then you had to go through its work, recalculate things and everything. I hope you remember that, right? If you don't, please go back and refer to that video again. You are missing out on those things, right? That is the benefit of having videos over here. As many times as you want, you can just go back, play them again and listen to them, right? That's the best revision. So there's the thin line difference. One is the expert which is engaged into this engagement by the management, and over here we are dealing with the experts who are engaged into this engagement by the auditor, right? So there can be an instance that Mr. X is an expert into certain field, right? And then Mr. X can be associated to the firm via the management when the management calls them, and he can also be associated to the entity via the auditor if the auditor appoints him, right? So in both the different situations, the capacity of Mr. X changes. At one point of time he would be the management's expert, and in the other instance he could be the auditor's expert at the same time, right? So what is more important is to understand who is bringing that expert into connection with the entity. Is it the management of the entity or is it the auditor of the entity? Right? So over here, SA 620 will basically deal with all the aspects that is related to the auditor's expert. Right? You remember we have 3 essays in this series, the series of 600. We have done the other 2 already, that is SA 600 and SA 610. Using the work of another auditor and using the work of an internal auditor. And today we are moving on to the third standard in that series, which is using the work of an auditor's expert. Right? Are you clear with what we are going to study in this lecture today? If yes, then we move ahead with it. Right? So basically this standard, right, it is dealing with the auditor's responsibility regarding the involvement of that expert. Right? We would see what is the responsibility of the auditor. That is the basic foundational stone on which the entire standard has been built. Now you understand that when we're talking about involving an expert, right, what are the various fields from where the experts can be involved? Obviously it is any other field other than accounting and auditing. Why? Because if you are involving an expert, an external expert, then what is your use in the company? We're talking about the auditor. When the management has involved you to perform the audit of this entity, of the company, right? The management considers you to be an expert in that field. That is why you have been employed. That is why you have been hired. You have been appointed actually. Neither employment nor hiring, right? Auditors are not employed, auditors are not hired. They are appointed. So the specific task for which you have been appointed is because you are an expert in the fields of auditing and accounting. So now if you need help, you may need help in some other field. Any other field which is not accounting and auditing. Right? That is one thing you need to understand. Second point of difference that you need to understand is that it can be an individual or an organization, you don't care. It has to be an expert. Either an organization is an expert or an individual is an expert, you have nothing to do with that. If it's an expert, then what is your responsibility while appointing that expert is what the essay will talk about. right? And there's one more thing over there, right? That the work of that expert has to assist the auditor in obtaining that sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. The audit evidence for specifically for which the auditor had involved the expert. For example, you want certain evidences on your gratuity calculation, your leave compensation and stuff, right? Who is the expert you involve? You involve the actuary, right? So what was the basic purpose of involving that actuary? Was that the work of that actuary can be used as a sufficient and appropriate audit evidence when you are reporting about the gratuity and the leave encashment, right? So now you understand the definition of the auditor's expert and the requirement of the standard, right? That is under the scope and objective of the standard. If we again pinpoint it down, there are 4 things you have to remember. 1, it is an expert. Whose? Auditors, right? Second, he has to be of any field other than accounting and auditing. Number 3, he can be an organization, or it can be an organization, or he can be an individual, right? And the last is that should be relevant for obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Clear with that? So when we start this standard, the first thing after this that we need to understand is not about the applicability. First we'll understand where will this standard not be applicable, right? The non-applicability of SA 620. Now, the first place, like take an instance, you may need an expert in a particular area, right? I'm still referring to it as particular area, not giving examples, I'm not giving you anything, because we will be discussing about the expertise when we will do the definitions, right? Over there I'll discuss with you in detail what are the other areas and everything, what you generally need to understand, right? Because you will have to grab things stepwise. If I involve everything in this conversation over here, right, when we are talking about something else, our basic funda over here is to understand where it is not applicable. Forget about the areas now, right? We'll deal with the areas separately. Just understand, whatever is the area, whatever is the procedure for which you want the auditor's expert to play his role, whatever it is, right? Then you go out and hire some expert in the field other than accounting and auditing, right? That is exactly what you are supposed to do. Now suppose your audit team has a member who otherwise, apart from being a chartered accountant, apart from having the expertise in accounts and audit, also possesses the relevant requisite expertise, right, to judge that field, to be able to help you out with that field. So you don't need to go out for an expert. Your team is capable enough to do it, do it. The statute, the standard, they never say that you will have to involve an expert. No, there is no you will have to. If you think it is necessary, if you think that would help your work, if you think that would help you arrange the sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, go for it. But there is no compulsion that yes, you have to involve an expert. No, you don't have to. If you yourself have those expertise, go ahead with it. If you don't, take help. Right? Next is expert's work is used by the entity. Yes. Now what is the situation? When do you think expert's work is used by the entity? Yes. When we are talking about, for example, the gratuity and the leave encashment, right? We gave you that example already, the actuary. So the management had involved Mr. KL Sondhi or something, XYZ, whosoever it is, right, as an actuary to whom they sent the data that was required, the entire detail of the number of candidates, their tenure and everything, the average, the standards that the firm has set. There's a lot of details that goes to the actuary, right? They have sent the details, and the actuary, based on those details, have given them a calculation, right? Actuary report, it's a long report that comes, right? It's a very good report. If you look at it, right, it is always bifurcated that this is gratuity, same kind of formats you'll get over there. This is the amount for all the several things in gratuity. Next you go to leave encashment, again it's the same block, and you get this is amount, and all the basis, all the assumptions, everything is mentioned in that report. If you get a chance, look at a report from the actuary, right? It is very interesting. At the end, for audit purpose, you just need to pick 3 figures from there, right? Nothing more than that. But if you are interested and you go through the report, right, you will see that yes, this assumption has been taken from the industry, this is the inflation rate this time, this is going from here, this is coming from there, this is the management's estimate. All these things are very specifically written over there, right? If you get a chance, go through it. So over here, if they had involved Mr. ML Sondhi, XYZ, whosoever it is, to prepare that data, then the auditor will not again employ that person, Mr. ML Sondhi, to help him evaluate whether or not it is correct. Okay, Mr. X, please come in. I have this report prepared by you. Please sit down and check and tell me whether you prepared it right or wrong. If he knew it was wrong, he would have rectified it already, right? There's no point. So remember, we are not talking about the data over here. If for calculating that data, management has involved an expert. No, we are specifically talking if the same person was involved by the management and you are involving the same person, it is not required. Hire somebody else. For that purpose, this standard is not applicable. And again, if management has involved an expert for some task, right, then you can judge the compatibility, the competence, the capability and the objectivity of that expert. Reperform his calculations, check his workings, do everything, right? But over there, if there is needed, you can still hire an expert to check the work of that expert, right? So please understand the interpretation of this line. Expert's work is used by the entity. We are not talking about that work. Mr. X prepared some data for the company and you are appointing Mr. Y to check it. It is valid. But if Mr. X has prepared the data, you cannot appoint Mr. X to check his own data. That is what this point means to say. Clear with it? Right? And if that part is clear now in your head, right, then we move ahead to understand that yes, it is the sole responsibility of the auditor for the audit opinion that he gives. Right? We have seen a similar situation when we were dealing the other standards in the series. So what happens basically is that the auditor has the sole responsibility for whatever opinion he is providing them with, right? And that responsibility of the auditor will never be diluted because he has used the work of an expert. No, we don't know who the expert is. It is not his liability. If he did not perform anything well, it is you who have to check. Before employing or before associating such an expert with your entity, with your job, with your assignment, right, with your engagement, you should have performed the due diligence to see whether or not that expert could perform correctly. And even if he could, if the due diligence was very proper and still he did not, then it is on you to check whether or not he has performed right. You cannot blindly trust. If you do, it is your loss. It's not your loss because 99% time if it's an expert and he is doing his work and he's reputed in the market, that is when you have appointed him, right? So he would give you a good and a valid result. But if at any point of time it goes wrong, then you will be held responsible for that. But again, there's one thing we always need to understand, that these standards, they are actually prepared to assist the auditor, right? They are not rules, regulations, foundations and bars for the auditors. No, it is always prepared to support the auditors. Hence, they have given a small scope for escape for the auditors, that yes, if you have followed all the provisions provided in this standard, right, and you have acted responsibly according to what the standard wanted you to do, and even after that if something goes wrong, it is not your responsibility. If you think that yes, whatever details or whatever evidences the expert has given, they are correct, what was your basis of judgment? If that basis is in line with the basis of the standard, we'll accept it. If your evaluation of the expert on the first hand was in line with the specifications given in the standard, we'll accept it. But if it was not, you will be held responsible. It is as simple as that, right? So that is it. First we have seen the non-applicability and then we have seen the auditor's responsibility for the audit opinion, right? And now we go on to see the objectives. So if I read over here, the objectives of the auditor are, number A, to determine whether to use the work of an auditor's expert. That means first of all, what you need to understand is, are you sure that you need an expert? Does the situation, does the circumstance necessarily call for an expert in its field, or do you have some alternative procedures for that, or do you have expertise in your own firm, right? If it is out of your hand, right, nobody is there in your firm who can deal with it, neither you have any alternate procedure to confirm the assertions that you are trying to check, then and only then you will involve an expert. But if it can be done, avoid. Right? But again, understand that the standard does not say that it is only then when you can do that. No, that is a situation which is lined down by the standard, that okay, if certain situations like that arise, then that is an indication that you need an expert. But otherwise, even though you have the competency, even though you have the capabilities, still you want to employ an expert, you can do that. There is no obstruction over there. It has to be your judgment, right? You will be found guilty only when you are wrong, or the expert has given a wrong decision. And then if you are checked and even you did not perform the correct due diligence and the correct procedures which have been aligned by the standard, then you would also be considered guilty in that situation, right? Next, if you read out, if using the work of an auditor's expert to determine whether that work is adequate for the auditor's purpose. That means if you are using his work, now you determine whether it is appropriate and adequate for audit purpose or not. So this means that on the first place, if you decide that yes, you need to use the work of an expert, then you involve an expert with your entity. Good with that, we don't have an issue, right? But once that expert has given you the relevant data and the relevant requirement has been fulfilled, right, then before blindly taking it forward and using it, right, into the area, inculcating or incorporating it into the area for which you had hired the expert, before that you need to do a parity check. You need to assure yourself that okay, as per your knowledge or as per whatever was provided and you have tested, it looks correct. If it does, take it ahead. If it does not, you are not supposed to take it ahead. So the second objective of the standard is that you need to determine, how do you determine whether that work will be useful? First, how will you determine whether or not to appoint an expert? Once he is appointed, then again you have to decide whether or not to use his work. So that is the basic objective of this entire standard. Choose, use, don't use. If you choose not to use, well and good. But if you choose to use, then after you get his data, again choose whether it is relevant, whether irrelevant. If it is irrelevant, out of the box, and if it is relevant, then you have to know where and how do you use it as sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Cool with that? So now I hope scope and objective is clear to you. If there is any query over here, please feel free to use the comment box below. Otherwise, if everything is going well, we will move ahead. So now as we are done with the scope and objective of the standard, we'll move ahead with the definitions. Right? So the definitions are on your screen. Please read it. Right? That is why I have given all the text on your screen, because over here just understanding is not important. You have to remember the definitions. Right? So who is an auditor's expert? An individual or organization possessing expertise in a field other than accounting or auditing, right, whose work in that field is used by the auditor to assist the auditor in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. An auditor's expert may be either an auditor's internal expert, right, that means who is a partner or a staff or including temporary staff or auditor of the firm or the network firm, or auditor's external expert. So you know that experts basically are not only those people who are outside the entity and you involve them, right? Experts are also those people who are already in your team. So if you remember, while we were discussing about the non-applicability, right, the first part was if you have the expert in your team, then we will not apply this essay, because this essay is basically applicable on the auditor's expert, that means the external expert. That is where the standard is basically bent towards. Right? But when we talk about auditor's expert, that can also be an internal expert. Although this standard does not take that part into consideration. Clear with that? So if you had any issue in mind, oh, we talked about auditor's expert being this, but over here they're talking about this and this. Where did and portion come in play? Right? So please understand the definition says it is internal or external, but the standard basically deals with the external part. Because for the internal part, the standard sees only one thing, that it is not applicable over there. All the applicability that we will be studying further will be based on the external part only. Clear with that? So when we talk about expert in a field other than accounting or auditing, right, then what are the areas that we are actually concerned with? What other experts? Right? We have been talking since the beginning of the standard that yes, expert should be an expert in the field other than accounting and auditing. What are those fields? What are those fields? That is what you need to understand. Now, for example, valuation. Right? You want to evaluate certain, you want the valuation, you want the value of certain financial instruments. You want the value of any intangible asset, any antique, any land, any building. Right? An asset which is acquired, any liability that you have assumed, anything, even if it is in the case of amalgamation, merger, whatever it is, right? If you want to value it, a valuer will be an expert, right? For example, if it's a cost and work accountant, he's an expert in his field to analyze the cost. You are not an expert in that field, so that will be an auditor's expert in some other field other than auditing and accounting. Right? Other experts would be like actuary. You involve actuary, right? You cannot get into that detailed calculation, the mathematical and the complex calculation of the gratuity and the leave encashment and stuff, right? Because it requires the present value of money and time value of everything. Everything is incorporated. It is very, very, very difficult thing, right? So you will need an expert in that field. And also remember, when I'm teaching you anything, right, always keep it clear in your mind that I am not going beyond the text to give you any vague examples. Even the examples that I will use, right, they are the examples that have been used by the institute. Because although I'm here to give you a detailed knowledge and everything on this topic, but I will always have my scope limited to the scope provided by the institute, right? So why do I also give these examples are that because if you want to quote it in the examination, you have something directly from the text of the institute. So what happens that if the same examples have been given to the valuer, the person who is checking your paper, he will have those examples that the institute has issued. And if you write the same example, he gives you full marks over there. Right? Because that person has very little time, very limited time to analyze whether even your example is correct or not. He'll just see your examples do not match, cross. It's out, right? So two examples we have seen already. One is the valuer and the other is the actuary, right? Third can also be a person who can estimate the reserves of oils and gas, because that is not a practical thing to do. I mean, obviously it is practical, that is why that person is able to do it, but when I call it practical means it is not an easy task to do, right? You just cannot take the scale and say, okay, the length, breadth and height of the liquid is this is the area. No, you calculate the volume. How do you calculate? Because when you're talking about oil and gas reserves, right, it is not in a container that you can calculate, that you calculate the volume, right, the surface area and everything. No, it is reserves. You never know how deep it is, how fast spread it is. It is not in a rectangular shape or a cuboid shape. No, it is vague. It is going from anywhere to anywhere in any direction. Similar to the gas. What is gas? Vapor. How do you measure it? Right? It becomes very difficult. So for that you can employ an expert. Right? Now if you have any environmental liabilities, any site cleanup costs, after you have performed this task over there and you leave it because the land is no more of your use, you will have to restore the site. Like what happens in mining. Right? Site restoration is a very important aspect over there. So you have to see how much will be the cost for site restoration, what will be required for site restoration, how much should be damaged that we are able to restore it, right? All these things have to be taken into consideration. Now other expert is like you are into the field of auditing and accounting. Remember, don't confuse with it. It is auditing and accounting. It is not your SFM, it is not your law, it is not your cost, it is nothing else. First paper and third paper, audit and accounts. So if you want an expert in law, that means person who can interpret the contracts, law, rules, regulations very well, then you will hire an expert. person who is expert in reading out the text of the law, right, and interpreting it in the correct manner, right? Now there is any complex tax calculation and you're not able to do it, you'll appoint somebody who's expert in that field, right? So these are the examples given over there, keep them in mind. So basically I have given you the example, I have read out the definition, but there are some other more things that you need to consider when you are reading this definition and when you are understanding the nature of auditor's expert, because the entire standard is depending on it. That single word, auditor's expert. Why? What are the prefix? Using the work. You don't need any explanation over there. The explanation that you need is on the work of the expert, right? On who is the auditor's expert. What do you consider? When do you involve him? Right? These are the things that you need to consider. So for that, this definition stands very important for your exam point of view as well. Okay with that? So we'll take up the different interpretation and some more detailed explanation about this topic in the next lecture. So until then, this is Abhinay Gupta signing off. Please stay tuned for the next lecture. Thank you and bye-bye.